Hello and welcome to Windows in Time Out in the Valley, Southern Oregon LGBTQ plus Histories, presented by Jackson County Library Services and the Southern Oregon Historical Society. I am Leah Pastizo, Digital Services Specialist. This program is being recorded. Please mute your microphone and turn off your camera to ensure quality recording. There will be a time to answer your questions at the end of the program. Jackson County Library Services acknowledges that its libraries are located within the traditional lands of the Shasta, Takelma, and Lakgawa people, whose descendants are now identified as members of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, as well as of the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians and Modoc Nation, who were forced to relocate to Oklahoma. We take this moment to recognize the Indigenous peoples whose traditional lands are where residents of Jackson County live today. JCLS is committed to fostering understanding, deep respect, and honor for Indigenous people, and we encourage you to learn more about the land you reside on. For more information, go to jcls.org/land. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Jackson County Library Services. And now I'll hand it off.
What we feature today is Anna Sloan, who's a good friend and a colleague, manager. She's the Curator of Collections at the Southern Oregon Historical Society, but she's also a research archaeologist for Southern Oregon University's Laboratory of Anthropology, and a fascinating person. She was born in Massachusetts. She attended New York University and has an undergraduate degree in anthropology. She then attended the University of Oregon and has a degree in a master's degree in anthropology with various subspecialties, including archaeology, but also museum studies. She's always been fascinated by the intersection of history, heritage, preservation, and gender and sexuality studies, all of which are encapsulated in today's presentation, Out in the Valley, Southern Oregon LGBTQ+. Anna.
Thanks everyone for being here today. Give me just a moment to get my notes up here. What a pleasure to be here today. Thanks for coming. I want to say a word before I begin about my inspiration and my positionality in relation to this topic. So as Larry mentioned, I'm an anthropologist, an archaeologist, a history and museum person generally. My training is in archaeology, and really specifically the overlaps between gender and sexuality studies and archaeology, history, and heritage practice. This has long been my interest. I'm also a queer and bisexual identified person. So I've also had interest for a long time in documenting the history of a community that I'm a part of. When I first became involved specifically in collections at Southern Oregon Historical Society, you know then that one of the first searches that I did in our online catalog was for local queer histories, LGBTQ plus history, gay history, lesbian history, and I came up short. We have very scant holdings in our collection at SOHS related to local LGBTQ plus histories. This is not a surprising thing necessarily. Archives, museums in general tend to have a lack of representation of these types of histories and holdings. There are a number of reasons for that. One is that sexuality and sexual identities are often couched in shame in American culture, more so in the past, but even still so today. And especially prior to the gay liberation movement, queer identities were not seen as parts of oneself that one would necessarily reveal publicly or want documented, right, in some form. These were seen as part of private life more generally, and parts of one's identity to keep secret. And of course, one of the reasons for that is because for much of US history, LGBTQ plus identities were also criminalized. So even if you were an LGBTQ plus identified person, you wouldn't necessarily have wanted that part of your life to be known. You wouldn't have wanted that part of your story to be documented because it would have literally made you less safe. It might have exposed you to social stigmatization, and it would have put you at risk of arrest or violence. And of course, this is still in some cases true today. But there are also other challenges here that add to the complexity. For example, the fact that labeling identities along the LGBTQ plus spectrum as such is also a relatively new phenomenon. I realized I was supposed to advance my slide by now. This is a relatively new thing, right? Now, that's not to say that people with these identities have not existed in human societies forever, which is true. We see evidence of LGBTQ plus identities along that whole spectrum existing through time across the world in many different cultural contexts. But the naming of these specifically in Western contexts as LGBTQ plus, or along that sort of gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender spectrum, this is relatively recent in terms of history, beginning in the 1950s and 60s, when these communities really coalesced around these specific identity terms. So for example, if we want to try to find men who loved men in the 1800s, which we know that that existed and that happened, or women who loved women in the 1700s, we need to look beyond these common identity terms of the current era, and in many ways read between the lines of the historic record. There are lots of debates about this currently in the field of history. For example, when we have Revolutionary War generals who pretty clearly were involved in loving relationships with other men, can we call them gay? They certainly wouldn't have understood themselves in their own historic context as gay, but today we understand their behaviors as associated with gay identity or queer identity. So how do we name these folks, right? You can see some of the complexities here. And then to top it off, the sexual aspects of people's identities have not always been seen as valuable history worthy of preservation. The materials that get preserved in archives and museum collections are always reflective of what is considered history worthy of preservation at any given time, right? Unfortunately, people in the history and heritage fields have only recently, as in within the past couple of decades, really realized how important it is to document these specific histories, these specific identities related to marginalized sexualities. We're fortunate that specifically LGBTQ plus archives and collections do exist in several places across the US. For example, the U of O has an excellent collection in their special collections related to Oregon LGBTQ plus histories. But in general, there aren't a lot of these materials to be found in archives and collections to help us understand these identities in the past. So when I realized that we didn't have a ton of materials related to these histories at SOHS, I was discouraged, but not surprised. This spring, I had the great pleasure of teaching a class at SOU on the politics of sexuality in US history. And I used this in conjunction with this talk as an opportunity to take a deeper dive into some of our regional queer histories. And what we find when we explore this, again, is still somewhat of a bits and pieces approach to a much larger puzzle. But I'd like to share some of those bits and pieces with you today as a starting point for building a more robust understanding of LGBTQ plus history in our region. I'm going to take just a moment to talk about why documenting such histories is important. My guess is that if you're here at the talk today, this is probably preaching to the choir a bit. But I think it's important to acknowledge why these specific histories are worthy of time and attention. As I mentioned, folks with identities along the LGBTQ plus spectrum, whether they called themselves that in their own historic moments or not, have always existed in human societies. There's ample evidence for queer identities throughout world history, and evidence in many cases that these identities were actually seen in certain cultural contexts as beloved, important, powerful, spiritual. Not necessarily marginalized and stigmatized in different times and places. This can be hard for us to wrap our heads around because we live in a time and place where these identities really are marginalized. But as I always tell my students, we have to think of marginalization as a social, cultural, and political invention rather than one that is inherent to human societies. So because LGBTQ plus people have always existed in our communities, we've always, we and they have always been making important contributions in communities, have always been folks that folks have known. And as history practitioners, then we aren't telling the full story if we don't document these histories as well and try to understand these identities. In fact, I would say that being a good historian means that you have an express responsibility to try and document these identities, or else we aren't viewing the full picture of what happened in the past. Aside from these reasons related to good scholarly practice and thorough documentation, we also do something important for contemporary communities when we spotlight these histories, which we know exist. We allow modern day LGBTQ plus folks to better see themselves in history. I bet we've all had experiences where we're taken by someone's biography who's a historic figure, or we see ourselves in figures from the past, and that sort of transports us in a way and gives us a deeper understanding of history. That can feel really empowering, and it's really important. Although many LGBTQ plus histories are hidden or obscured, when we are able to dig them out of the archive, they can serve as important reminders that LGBTQ identified people have always existed, have always overcome challenges, and have made significant contributions to their communities. And here in Southern Oregon, we have another good reason to better study and document these histories because we're home to some very interesting and distinctive parts of this story. Because documentation locally has been scant, we have our work cut out for us. So again, I'm viewing this talk as sort of a beginning to something that I'm hoping to develop over the coming years. And I'm going to enlist hopefully everybody's help in doing that by the end of the lecture. Okay, so I always like to start local history talks in the period of Western settlement because it allows us to consider what came before, right? And of course, there are thousands and thousands of years worth of Indigenous history in our region, with several tribes making their homes on the land that is now known as the Rogue Valley. Maps are imperfect. Okay, maps are a tool for understanding certain concepts and certain ideas. This is an imperfect map, but it's demonstrative of something. I like using these maps from this website, nativeland.ca. Anybody might be familiar with this. If not, I encourage you to look at this because you can type in any address in the US, actually really in the world, and look at the overlapping territories of Indigenous peoples that correspond to that address. And again, you know, maps are imperfect. There are some imperfections in this map, but it's full and vibrant, and it gives a sense that Oregon was not vacant prior to Western settlement, right? And that there are many overlapping groups that claim this territory as their own. We can also look at how these areas were affected by treaties. And this is another great layer to these maps available on nativeland.ca. You can look at, I'll see if I can put my cursor over at the treaty section here and see which lands were subject to which treaties. And so we can see that land that we are traditionally on today is Takelma, Shasta, Cow Creek Band of Umpqua, with some overlap with Klamath and Modoc tribes, and even perhaps some overlap with Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla territories. And that some members of these groups, not all, but most, were forced onto reservations, including the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians. The federally recognized tribes in our region, as we've heard also in the land acknowledgement today, are Grand Ronde, Siletz, and also Cow Creek Band of Umpqua. This process of removal was done through, in many ways, violent means, including the Rogue River Wars of 1855, 1856. And something that we need to consider here, and I give credit to scholars of Native feminism and queer indigeneities who have been calling this out for the past few decades, is that the destruction and demonization of distinctive Indigenous forms of gender and sexual expression, which in many cases would have included identities along the LGBTQ plus spectrum, was part and parcel of the colonization process, and in fact was a crucial part of that process. When you root out traditional gender structures in societies, you really get at the heart of a people. And trying to eradicate Indigenous peoples and Indigenous modes of gender expression in favor of white, Christian, patriarchal, heteronormative modes of gender expression became a key strategy in eradicating Native American culture in Oregon and elsewhere in the US. So we have to consider this, and information on the history of Indigenous LGBTQ plus identities, often referred to as two-spirit identities. That is sort of a pan-Indian term that came about during the period of the American Indian movement, and it refers to many different types of gender and sexual expression that are sort of on that spectrum. It can be incredibly difficult to find these identities in the archive for some of the reasons that I've already discussed, But what we do see, especially when we're looking to Southern Oregon, are breadcrumbs in the languages and vocabularies of some of the tribes in our region. And that's what I'm going to talk about for just a moment today. For example, there is a Takelma word. I'm going to probably mispronounce all of these words, but I'm going to attempt. I think it's important to say them aloud. Sa-wisa. This is a term that's been documented by First Nations Cree scholar Harlan Pruden as a male assigned two-spirit identity. This is a term that we also find in the ethnographic literature related to our region, which I note is largely authored by white anthropologists like Edward Sapir and Dennis Gray, and which in their documentation translates to go-between, essentially someone who helped to make peace between quarreling parties in times of conflict. We see this term represented in the papers of Virginia Card, who was a Native American woman who lived in the Rogue Valley in the 50s and 60s and who tried to document all that she could during that time of Takelma lifeways. She records this term in her papers, which are pictured here. We have these in the collection at SOHS. So we know from this that there is at least one form of two-spirit identity that would have been practiced amongst the Takelma. We also see terms in Shasta language. This is a term that has been documented by historian and scholar of two-spirit lifeways, Will Roscoe. The term is Gituk Uwahi. And again, please forgive my mispronunciation. This is a great book by Will from the late 80s, so a little bit dated, but a great entree into understanding two-spirit identities in the US more generally. And this specific term in the Shasta language referred to two-spirit folks who were assigned male at birth, but lived their lives in such a way that they crossed gender identities. And then we see another term in the Klamath language, another two-spirit identity term. And as stated by author Derek DeForest, referring to this term, quote, in the Klamath language, there are no distinct gender pronouns. The word K means both he and she. Traditionally, Klamath people who had integrated their masculine and feminine might be described as a balanced relative, okay? Another term that has been identified by modern day two-spirit Klamath people is Lap Stanash Shukla, meaning two souls mixed together. So an important thing to note here is that all of these terms are very much integrated into specific cultures, and each of them are going to mean something slightly different. So for this reason, I always suggest that further learning happen through the lens of Indigenous peoples themselves, right, about these terms. There's a great example of an individual known locally as White Cindy, who was a two-spirit Klamath person, assigned male at birth, but lived life as a woman, and referred to themselves as half she and half he. White Cindy was a botanist, healer, sort of known locally. And this article from the 1950s talks a little bit about their life. So again, we have a sense here that the tribes of our region had these two-spirit identities as part of their lifeways, and that people who identified with these terms were part of their communities. Probably one of the reasons why we have so little information on these is that, again, these are identities that were actively eradicated through numerous ways and numerous forms as part of the process of settling our region. And again, great history resources for understanding more about tribal entities can be found through the websites of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, Confederated Tribes of Siletz, Cow Creek Band of Umpqua, and other tribes of our region. Each tribe has their own sort of heritage and history department. So I always encourage folks to look up those resources because you'll get a really tribally authored perspective on some of these histories, which is very, very valuable. Okay, so on the one hand, we have the fact that this process of Western settlement played a major role in the disruption of Indigenous two-spirit identities. And this is sort of one facet on the prism of history. But for the Anglo-American settlers who participated in these early waves of migration to the West in the early and mid-1800s, there's evidence to suggest that perhaps more so than we might assume, they found a world where gender and sexuality out West were being less policed, less regulated than in other parts of the nation at the same time. In many ways, this was the Wild West, right, where people were sort of free to get up to all sorts of things, including gender deviance. Historian Peter Bogue has written a wonderful book on this subject, which I recommend, Redressing America's Frontier Past. Most of the examples that Bogue documents in his book are individuals who were assigned female at birth, but lived their lives in frontier societies as men, and in many cases were accepted by their communities. It's hard to tell whether or not folks really understood that these individuals were living in a different gender assignment than one might assume. But it's interesting, after many of their deaths, when it became apparent that they were living their lives as a different gender than the one that was likely assigned to them at birth, communities often rallied around them and sort of uplifted their the identities that they felt comfortable with during their lifetimes. Bogue speaks about this phenomenon in his book, and in his introduction he states, quote, that cross-dressers were not simply ubiquitous in the gold rush era West, but were very much a part of daily life on the frontier. I suspect that readers will be amazed as I was with the number and variety of cross-dressers who found a home on the proverbial range. One such example, who is represented in our SOHS collection by this informational pamphlet that was put out by the Pajaro Valley Historical Association in 1959, is Charlie Parkhurst, a famed stagecoach driver who traveled routes mostly through California, but with some overlap in Southern Oregon. Charlie was born in 1812 as Charlotte Parkhurst in Massachusetts, orphaned at a young age, and ended up heading out west early on in life. He began living his life as a male-identified person at this point in time, and he took on work as a stagecoach driver and quickly developed a reputation as a really tough, gritty, skilled person. There's a sort of a folkloric tale that he lost an eye after being kicked in the face by a horse that he was trying to shoe. And then he was known thereafter as One-Eyed Charlie. He was known for being really good with the whip and just being a really rough and rugged type of person. Interestingly, in November 1868, Charlie cast a vote in the national election as a man, of course. But given the fact that Charlie was assigned female at birth, some historians would then say that Charlie becomes the first female assigned at birth person to vote in the United States, 52 years before Congress passed the 19th Amendment. Interestingly and tellingly, the authors of this pamphlet do refer to Charlie with he, him pronouns. Again, sort of emphasizing the fact that Charlie's community, whether or not they suspected that this person might have had a slightly different gender identity than the one they were assigned at birth, they thought of this person as a man. He lived his life as a man, and the community understood him as a male-embodied person. So I have to talk a little bit about these great photos that I'm sort of peppering in through this part of the presentation. Around the turn of the 20th century, we get these great examples, with actually several in the SOHS collection, of what are labeled and understood as gag photos. Okay, so sort of funny photos that are meant to induce a laugh, people playing dress up. Mostly these are of women in male dress. And what's interesting about these images is that we can absolutely read them as meant to be, humorous plays on gender dynamics and nothing really more than that. But I think we miss an opportunity there. I think we need to leave space here for queer possibilities in these images, even if that just means women who sometimes got their kicks dressing up as men and enjoyed doing it, right? What these images signal to me are people who, during an era of increasing regulation over sex and sexuality in the US, were using humor and costume to express themselves and to explore gender norms as somewhat of a playground. And they're just delightful to see. I think these are really, really fun. This series here is from the Simpson de Haven glassplate negative collection that we have at SOHS. So even though there was perhaps opportunity for more gender deviance and gendered play in the West leading up to the turn of the 20th century, that did not mean that life was open, safe, or inclusive for folks with identities along the LGBTQ plus spectrum at this time in most situations. And in fact, this became increasingly so as we sort of marched to the end of the 19th century and began the 20th century. Oregon had somewhat of a wiggly sodomy law on the books starting in 1853, but strengthened those laws in 1913 as a result of one of these gay scares that were happening in a lot of cities at the time in Portland. And in general in the US, the 1880s and the several decades following that were a time of vice crusades, of increasing regulations over sexuality and perceived obscenity in American society. And of course, homosexuality was a central target of these types of legislation and policing practices. In Oregon, unfortunately, we have a long, deep history of forced sterilization of gay and lesbian people. In 1917, our legislature enacted a strict and extreme sterilization law that targeted, quote, all feeble-minded, insane, epileptic, habitual criminals, moral degenerates, and sexual perverts. So under this umbrella, in the understanding of the time, would have fallen LGBTQ plus identified people. This policy would remain in effect, believe it or not, until 1953. Accounts in local newspapers document some of this criminalization of homosexuality that was happening everywhere at this time, but certainly so in Oregon and in Southern Oregon. The term sodomy is used here, and I want to talk a little bit about this term because it's an important term for historians to understand. It's somewhat of a wishy-washy term. Sodomy in the US is broadly defined as sexual deviance, and what constitutes sexual deviance, of course, has very much been defined by the social and cultural trends of certain moments in history. Okay? So the definition of sodomy has changed through time and in different places in the US. And in exploring queer histories, especially of this period, we need to use this word, but use it somewhat as a code word because it's often associated with same-sex relations. It can be a way of seeing LGBTQ plus identified people in the past, but unfortunately, it's always through this lens of criminalization, okay? Similar terms like invert or third sex can also be useful in doing historical research during this period on LGBTQ plus identities. And again, using newspapers is where we sort of see some of this coming out. Reporting crimes such as this in the newspaper was really a mode of public shaming. So this would have affected people's status within their communities, their careers, etc. Now, Americans' general understanding and knowledge of gay and lesbian identities would greatly expand during the 1940s and 50s. I didn't know this, but doing the research for this class I taught, I learned that World War II was somewhat of a major coming out moment for many people in the US. This was one of the first times where there were sort of burgeoning understandings about homosexuality. People were gathered together in spaces that were often same-sex spaces. And it's interesting to see how there's a real change and shift in the coalescing of LGBTQ identities post-World War II. Of course, this is also the time of the Kinsey Report, a really enlightening moment for Americans in terms of the sexuality and sexual practices of one's communities and one's neighbors. The statistics in the Kinsey Report said a lot, in fact, about homosexuality in rural communities, which was portrayed as being far more prevalent than probably anybody imagined. As Peter Bogue explains in his book, quote, Alfred Kinsey found and reported his eyebrow-raising sexual behavior in the human male that the highest frequencies of homosexuality in America that he uncovered were in fact in rural communities in the most remote parts of the country, particularly the West. And this would have included ranchmen, cattlemen, prospectors, lumbermen, farmers. So it's safe to say, again, that homosexual people were part and parcel of Southern Oregon's rural landscape at this time, but the realization of that would have been a real shocker, probably to most people living in these communities. With the 1950s, we see the creation of gay and lesbian advocacy groups on a more national level, things like the Mattachine Society, the Daughters of Bilitis. So there's, again, this real sort of coalescing around these emergent identities that people are finally naming as gay, lesbian, mostly gay and lesbian at that time, but sort of the sense that these are identities that one can embody, not just behaviors and practices that one might have during one's lifetime. The 1960s, of course, were a landmark time for LGBTQ plus visibility, advocacy, and rights in the US. In some ways, Oregon was ahead of the game in terms of LGBTQ organizing and activism. Our sodomy laws were repealed in 1971, which was ahead of many other states. And this is a period where we really start to see a more robust archive for Southern Oregon, especially because our region was pivotal for lesbian collective organizing and Back to the Land movements. Queer communes and organizations like Golden, the Oregon Women's Land Trust, Women's Source, Rootworks, Groundworks, were created really to allow LGBTQ plus identified people, and sometimes in these more specifically lesbian identified people, to live in free, open environments that actively subverted patriarchal and heteronormative social structures and served as manifestations of Back to the Land movements that were examples for organizers in other parts of the country. In our region, actually more specifically a little bit north of us, in the sort of vast area of wilderness spanning Grants Pass to Roseburg, this was really a hotbed for this type of organizing, and specifically for lesbian separatist communities that were, again, part of this women's land movement. Many of these places fostered lesbian art collectives and publications, and some of these are in fact still around. For example, the community formerly known as Woman Share has recently become Native Woman Share, and is now a place that is has leadership being led by Indigenous individuals in our community. They describe the project as, quote, an Indigenous landscape led by Takelma and First Nations women and Two-Spirit for community healing, land healing, art, and culture. Look them up if you haven't. Native Woman Share, they're doing incredible things right now. And scholars like Heather Burmester have done a fantastic job of documenting some of these histories and collecting oral histories from some of the central figures in this movement. The U of O has a fantastic collection, again, of these materials specifically. It's called the Southern Oregon Country Lesbian Archival Project, or SOCLAP. One of the things that I'm excited about for SOHS is that we're working with a local donor and have hopes of soon adding issues of Woman Spirit magazine to our archives. This was one of these wonderful creative expressions that came out of the women's land movement. The publication is described as, quote, a magazine of feminist spirituality, chronicling the exciting exploration of women's changing lives through 1974 to 1984. Jean and Ruth Mountain Grove, who were sort of well-known figures in the lesbian land separatist movement, were editors of this publication. And this archive, despite the fact that we're hoping to get some hard copies at SOHS, you can actually explore this yourself. These are available digitally on JSTOR, and all of the issues are all scanned. So a great resource for folks to know about. So despite the fact that this type of organizing and same-sex community building was happening in these more rural areas of our region, what we're hearing about the experiences of LGBTQ plus youth who grew up more in the city centers during this time suggests that these were not welcoming areas, right? At SOHS, we're in the midst of an oral history documentation project with local LGBTQ plus elders. And through their reflections, we're hearing about experiences of homophobia and discrimination during this time that led young people to stay closeted for much of their early lives, despite understanding at young ages that they were lesbian and gay identified. So this was an era when queer meeting spaces were really important. They somewhat helped these identities to coalesce and some of these advocacy organizations to come together. They allowed LGBTQ plus identified folks to gather outside of the public view, to express themselves, to have a sense of freedom that was unavailable to them in society at large, to build community and to find love for one another. Some of these spaces were more well understood as gay and lesbian social spaces or establishments, and others were less formally identified as such, but they were all crucial for these communities at this time. So through some of this oral history work, we're learning about places like Cook's Bar in Ashland, the bar Abajo in Ashland, and apparently the bar in the Medford Hotel below the Candlelight Room, which was known as sort of a gay men's meeting space during this era. So again, these are breadcrumbs, right? We're sort of starting with these little pieces that we're able to glean about these local histories and local meeting places, and starting to develop these into fuller understandings. Through some of our work, again, with these elders who are participating in the oral history project, one of whom, I'm sorry to call you out, Donna. Donna Taylor, one of our wonderful participants, is in the audience today. Thank you for coming, Donna. We've been starting to document some of the specific challenges faced by LGBTQ plus identified people in Southern Oregon at this time, as well as community building and political organizing efforts, with the goal of making this area more inclusive. For an archive like SOHS that, again, really had sort of scant materials, everything is precious that comes in. So I was thrilled when Donna donated a number of materials to us related to lesbian and queer organizing in the Ashland and Talent area in the 1990s onwards. And this really helps us document this moment in time, a lot of the organizing that was happening. I can't downplay the importance of just having more representations like this in our archive. One interesting phenomenon that Donna sort of helped to illuminate through our oral history work with her was the role of the local Methodist Church in helping to advocate and support local LGBTQ plus folks. And a little bit more digging in our collections helped me see that we actually do have some representations of this specific history, which I was happy to see. We've got several awards that were received by Ross and Marjorie Knotts, who were real leaders of sort of the Methodist churches in the area. They were real community folks. I wouldn't be surprised if folks in the audience sort of knew them or remembered them. But they received Lambda Awards, which we have in our possession. And through some of the recollections that we've been exploring through the Oral History Project, we've been able to see how important this type of allyship was for people at the time. For example, having an embedded religious institution in the community that could help support things like marriages, right? At a time where some of this was still being heavily stigmatized. The one item that did come up in my initial search for LGBTQ materials in our collection at SOHS is this sign from the Abdel Ellis Community Center. And this sign has a story, which is a hard and sad story, but it's an important one to tell. This is a community center that was named for Roxanne Ellis and Michelle Abdel. They were a lesbian couple who were murdered in Medford in 1995, a terrible, terrible event. But they had been important figures in the community. They were political organizers against some of the anti-LGBTQ bills that came through the Oregon legislature in the 1990s. Things like Measure 9, which would have amended the state constitution to declare homosexuality abnormal, wrong, unnatural, and perverse. Hard to imagine. And Measure 19, which was essentially a library censorship bill aimed at texts that had mention of homosexuality. Everything that I've heard about these two activists and organizers is that they were wonderful, beloved people, and their deaths were a huge loss for the community. In the aftermath, the community created the Abdel Ellis Center in Ashland as a place for support and advocacy for the local LGBTQ community. The center was open for 14 years and closed in 2010. So this sign documents not only the things that these two folks did in their lives, but also the center that was named for them and some of the organizing that's been happening since that time. I'm also excited that we've recently been given permission to retain copies of the Wildlife video program. This was a program produced by Scott Clay and Dennis Vickerin, done through SOU and RVTV. And it has interviews with local LGBTQ identified people in the 2000s, a wealth of information and perspectives from folks in different walks of life about their experiences of LGBTQ life locally in Southern Oregon, but also connecting to sort of national level trends as well. So what I'm excited about here too is just increasing community visibility. We've got 54 discs here that we'll be copying with these episodes. So it's going to be a wealth of information specifically for this time period. So we're making strides forward, but we still have such a long way to go in terms of building a collection that better represents the histories of LGBTQ plus identified people who have called our region home over the years. Current collecting efforts include working with the folks who organize the Queer Indigenous Gathering that happens at SOU every year. This is another wonderful thing to have on your radar. It's a yearly sort of gathering where they bring in scholars and activists and speakers from other parts of Oregon, other parts of the US who are queer, Indigenous identified, Two-Spirit identified for a celebration. So my hope is that many of the materials related to the planning of this celebration will end up residing with us at SOHS at some point in time. We already have little bits that have been gathered from this event in the past. I'm excited to share that SOHS will be tabling at Pride this year, Medford Pride 2024. And part of that will be a collecting station for Pride memorabilia to help us document this event. And again, this will be a start. I'm hoping that we can continue to do this for years to come. And we've got other projects in the works at SOHS as well. So this spring, through the work that I've been doing at SOU, through this course that I taught, a few instructors and I got together to host what we termed an intergenerational LGBTQ plus gathering, where we brought local queer elders in the community into conversation with some of our students to talk about their experiences of life growing up in the Rogue Valley, living in the Rogue Valley as LGBTQ plus identified people, sort of a community building and story sharing effort. This was interesting because it really was very fruitful, much more fruitful than we had expected. People were really openly sharing their stories. So we're thinking about ways for the next time we do it to document these stories and be able to keep them in our care at SOHS. I've mentioned this oral history documentation project where we are collecting oral remembrances, stories, and knowledge from local folks who have been part of the LGBTQ community locally. And I'm so pleased that the folks who have contributed their stories to that so far, and we're hoping to have more stories coming in. And then again, we're actively trying to build up our collections in this way. We're seeking out photographs, videos, documents, objects that reflect local experiences of LGBTQ plus life, so that these pieces of history don't get lost to time. Things like local merchandise from our local drag queens who have shows that they do often in Ashland, things from the student groups that are coalescing at SOU. But again, a lot of this is related to contemporary stories. And this is where I need your help. I'm hoping that one of the things that comes out of this is to have any community members who do have these stories about local LGBTQ life, history, identities, activism, to get in touch with us at SOHS, because we would love to document your story. We'd love to be able to have these stories as part of our repository to help even out and balance the histories that we're able to tell about our region. Thanks, everyone. That's what I've got for today.